Going to be a head on top of a figure I'll show you in a moment. Don't worry if little pieces are falling off. And that's all harvested from neighbors, which is cool. Free art supplies. And I'm going to be exhibiting a piece at the Museum of Science and Industry, actually two pieces, maybe more, at Mosey, which is real fun for me because, as you know, if you're from Tampa, Mosey was the coolest thing in the world growing up. The Hurricane Tunnel and all that. So I reached out to a bunch of galleries and museums, and Mosey, they were like, "This is perfect. This is exactly what we want kids to do. Kind of make art out of." So I'm actually going to put that on that's the head for this. So that's Da Vinci's, yeah. Yeah. So that's over in my backyard. You might have seen this one here on my front yard, my parents' front yard. That was out there for many months until the rain got in. But that was really cool because it was lit up in green and it was really cool looking. So sadly, I haven't replaced it with something else, but I should soon. It's not something that survives the rain or the sun for very long. Even if you inject it with all kind of chemicals, I think even then it'll warp. So it's kind of more indoor sculpture. But this one's going to be up at Mosey. This is really big. You can kind of see the scale here. So yeah, that's at the Scarfone Gallery. So that's kind of what I do. I do a lot of painting and stuff too. But bamboo is definitely kind of unique enough where I think it's cool. It's not like really, it's not like you're doing marble and stone or metal that's going to fall on people. So it's very safe, very lightweight, and it's made out of yard waste, which is really cool. So I hope you guys get up to MoMA in the winter to see it. Mosey, sorry, it's MoMA, New York.
Aspirational thoughts.
Right, yeah, MoMA, even better. Thank you. MoMA. One day, but something like this certainly puts me on the map artistically, so I'm really excited. It's gonna be a real pain in the butt to finish the feet and the hands, but I'm working on that now. But yeah, I'll stay in touch with you guys about that. But now let's talk about the secularization of art. And yeah, I think you guys all know the word secular. We live in kind of a very secular world, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because that involves separating church and state. And by the way, okay, Bruce, we're ready to get going. So, and I'm sad that this is our last class, but we'll of course pick up later. And I'm thinking what I'd like to do, maybe either in the winter or next summer, is focus um, on the 20th century and artists from Latin America and the United States, starting with the muralist movement, which was big in Mexico and in the United States. And it's kind of that era of technology and art starting to really compete in full swing in the 1920s. And we'll see a little taste of that, but I think that might be a great subject because even though like artists like the Mexican muralists weren't overtly, in fact, I'd say they were very deliberately non-Christian, I think it still informs their work quite a bit, even in spite of their sort of atheism. Even people like Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera still clearly have the sort of they're leaning on ethics and morality, and I think you can't separate those things from Christianity. So I think that's a good starting point for today because I think you really have to wonder about or contemplate or consider the nature of morality and ethics once you secularize and separate church and state. That doesn't mean you've sort of you've cut your value system in half, right? I think it means you've kind of made your value system, or at least your spiritual system, more personal and not subject to state scrutiny or maybe and social scrutiny, sure, but there's no official state-sanctioned religion that makes your religion outlawed, and that's the whole premise of the United States, that we can at least ostensibly live in peace in spite of our religious differences, right? But of course, now we live in an age where politics has become our religion. As we know, we totally live in harmony in spite of our political differences. And I think that's a really interesting analogy for, I like to really think about whether or not that's the same. Like, have we reached a level where politics has sort of become our morality and our ethics? Of course, not everyone, but certainly, as you know, a lot of people, it seems to have substituted for spiritualism, faith. So there's an interesting question kind of lurking in the background today, which is like, well, where is religion still the wellspring of our morality and our ethics? And or if it isn't, then do we still kind of long for that? And I think in a way, surrealism kind of fills that void, and I think you'll see that in a lot of artwork, a struggle for kind of preserving a sense of spiritual sacredness in spite of things being very kind of photographic and proof based and just overall kind of very different than I think the world that these kind of spiritual canvases were catering to. So I think we've also updated our value system according to our new set of kind of modern values. And maybe, well, let me ask you guys, what would you say are modern sort of American values? So forget the religion for a moment because we're going to try to bring them back together. Like, what would you say makes our very fundamental values in the United States today?
freedom of expression.
Freedom of expression, and I don't think you'd see that necessarily as like one of the seven deadly sins, like the lack of silence, right? Or expression. So we've kind of made that so important to individual sort of having a voice, having a sense of kind of meaning as an individual. So freedom of expression is a big one. What's another one?
Rule of law.
Rule of law, right? Obeying the law, obeying traffic rules, as we all know. When someone breaks the rules of traffic, it's like one of the seven deadly sins, right? Might as well be, because it's really that's so central to safety and the idea of like us all benefiting from everyone obeying the rules of law, right? That guy who stands up in the airplane right when the plane lands, that kind of person, they're going to purgatory. So according to the copper rings, the airplane springs, whatever. So what's another value? We've got freedom of expression, rule of law, individuality, right? Versus collectivism, perhaps. And I think that's very interesting because it's good and bad, right? Being part of a collective is good, but also can be bad because maybe it stifles your own expression. But of course, being individual means you celebrate your expression, but maybe sometimes you don't benefit from the collective. And that, I think, is very interesting in the world of art, because I think we kind of want to have our cake and eat it too. I think we tend to live in a more individualized world than the past, and that has a lot to do with technology and other things that affirm the importance of the individual, but maybe affirm us a little too much, maybe in the age of TikTok and the sort of narcissism of looking in the mirror and showing everyone what you ate for every meal. And I think most of us are old enough to like the idea of looking at a slideshow of someone's like vacation was boring, right, back in the day. Now that's the norm, to show everyone basically a slideshow of your life, and that's what you scroll down through their Instagram page, and then it's just like an endless stream of like pictures. It's like, boy, documented everything. So what's another value today that we have?
I don't think we think about it, but freedom of movement.
Yeah, sure. Being able to see more of the world that used to be restricted to people with privileged access to transportation.
Like borders.
Borders, yeah. Okay, there you go. Yeah, and I think that's a good question with globalization. Like, and then we'll kind of get to that at the end. It's just like, is the nation is that obsolete? Do we kind of identify as a globe? Kumbaya, not Kumbaya, Epcot Center. I'm thinking it's a small world after all, right? So I think in a way there's it makes sense. Cultural globalization, economic globalization, political globalization is a little trickier, right? When it comes to like, do you want one central world government or do you want local sort of accountability? So I think that's the conflict between globalization and sort of local. Remember, think global, act local, think global. That's kind of gone because now it's just global, right? Now we're just not even thinking local anymore. So I think that has a lot to do with technology disrupting our value system and updating our values accordingly. Anything else? Any other values make America, that makes the United States, uniquely American in our value system?
Or education?
Yeah, I think the value of education, and that's important. Last week I talked about John Locke, and he's so important as kind of seeding the values that became the Enlightenment and enshrined into the Constitution, which is basically a lot of the things we're talking about. And that includes like the idea that a child is born with a tabula rasa, right? So you're not born one with a kind of condemned to live a certain life, but rather it's balanced between nurture and nature. And so hopefully we create societies that acknowledge both sides, the importance of both, right? But I think we're also, to a degree, wading into sort of new territory that's really hard for us to kind of reconcile with the past. And so I think even now today, we're at a kind of more urgent sort of battle with technology and figuring out sort of where does morality come from, and is the canvas or is a photograph a sacred space, and where is sacredness in the world? Now, one thing I didn't realize that I learned recently, which is, in Protestant art, what really fills the void left with art is music, right? And I think you see that really when we hear that when we are in the church, and that's so interesting because, yeah, I think music is in fact more kind of free from the sort of prejudices of pictures and what people look like and making it sort of look like something familiar. Music's more abstract and arguably more kind of closer to God. So I think that flourishing of music in Europe, especially Bach to Beethoven, etc., was, I think, somewhat of a response to the need for sacredness in the world. And I think today, like, where is sacredness today, apart from religion, but having separated church and state? Is there a domain for sacredness? I mean, is sports fanaticism, is that sacredness? I mean, yeah. Do we have awe before? Maybe science gives us a sense of awe when we look at, pictures of solar nebula or whatever they're called, those, beautiful pictures from outer space. Of course, they're very beautiful, but they're huge and, like they make you feel very small and kind of insignificant. So I think a question just to think about is, are artists sort of, are they still kind of meant to be prophets, or are artists really just sort of, making money and selling stuff and it's just commercials? And so where is the sacredness today? And especially with music, right now, music is kind of losing its sacredness because I don't even know if it was written by a human being anymore. And it probably wasn't. And if it was, they're, making their voice auto-tuned, so it sounds really robotic and soulless. So that soullessness, I think, is so characteristic. Because the other negative side, of course, the United States is materialism, maybe degree of like the individualism can be too, hardcore, but I don't think there's any absolutes ever. But these are just some thoughts to think about. I think we left off with the Counter Reformation, so we're going to jump we're going to jump through time and move forward. I think his face captures a lot of the anxiety people are feeling today in the world, especially post-pandemic. So I think someone asked about this map last week, and this might not have been exactly the same one we saw. And I don't know exactly the date. This is just, I used it more to show roughly the kind of broad strokes of what's going on in Europe with the separation of the Protestant areas and the Catholic areas. Clearly, Catholics like warmer weather, Protestants like colder weather. It's interesting to think about. There is probably a component of culture, and then how culture is culture downstream from religion, is religion downstream from culture. But certainly, this map is like insurmountable differences, right? You got to wonder about those little pockets of blue right there. Everyone around them didn't like them. I think the blue is Protestant, right? So Catholics, an oasis of Protestantism in an ocean of Catholicism, or the other way around up north. And of course, the Anglican Church. And all this strife led to people fleeing the United States to, as we all learned growing up, to create a kind of nation with what pluralism, with sort of different religion, where different religions can coexist. And again, I think it's interesting to think about whether or not politics is sort of the new religion, and if we're once again at this point where we have to figure out how we can coexist without, a lot of, maybe not bloodshed, but certainly flame wars, a lot of flame wars as they call them on the internet. And even now that like people have kind of just tuned out of social media as a platform for politics, because you realize, like, what's the point? I'm just going to make myself older and more wrinkled by arguing with people about things that you really can't necessarily be right about, like something like abortion, right? If everyone has their own belief, and it's probably best that maybe that's a personal belief, but of course some of these issues may require government involvement, and that's of course when it becomes really hotbed of controversy, and that's when you probably are going to just stay at home and not say anything. But so stuff like this sculpture shows you the kind of Catholic response to Martin Luther. The people down here would be your Protestants, and that would be like some representing the Catholic Church, sort of you're basically smiting or denouncing the Protestants in sculptural form. And the Protestants respond with their own kind of, here's the Pope as a kind of fire-breathing monster there. And so there's I think there's a real legitimate criticism of the Catholic Church's corruption. Of course, the Bible gives you this direct relationship to God, and so that's a big game changer where Martin Luther basically kind of affirmed this idea that you don't need the church, you can speak to God directly through the Bible. And of course, the Muslim world is another kind of important part of the chessboard, with most of the world kind of converting to this new religion. And then, of course, within Christianity, you have this conflict. Thank goodness we have these two other continents that provide a kind of blank slate for this new kind of system, which we have here today. And other important inventions include what we have here. What are we looking at? Right. Right. And so, very interesting godlike powers of seeing things that you can't see with the naked eye, both out in the outer space and into the micro-universe. And of course, with these, you have to recalibrate a whole sense of understanding of the world. Now, interestingly, as you guys know all this, the sun is in the center of our solar system. Of course, we're, at least in terms of Galileo, he probably would have said, well, we're not the center of the universe. But I think it's interesting that with all of our telescopes, it still seems that life is the exception and not the rule. So who knows? We could turn out to be, the exception in the universe. And, I think that's a fascinating thing that we haven't necessarily found life on another planet yet, and that might be good that we don't, depending on, you've seen a lot of Independence Day.
It doesn't go well.
Which one?
It doesn't go well.
Yeah, it doesn't go well, usually for us. Columbus, the Native Americans, we would be the Native Americans in that case, right? So they would be Columbus. And Cortez, it's not Columbus, it's the Cortez you got to watch out for. So here you go. Here's our cartographer, And I'm just trying to show you some pictures that show the world drifting away from a spiritual world towards one that's more materialistic and based on, the idea that with science we have the supreme sense of control over the world. And of course, God laughs at that kind of that confidence we have. But I think that self-confidence grows over the centuries and is reaching a kind of a point, boiling point now, where we're kind of now wondering, well, okay, with all this science, okay, do we feel a set? Are we happier? Are we living our best lives? Is there something missing? And I think you'll see that in the backdrop in a lot of paintings in the early 20th century, especially the sense that like the modern world isn't everything it's cracked up to be. And I think these revolutions certainly are the kind of are a big change away from the old world, and very much fueled by scientific advancements that fuel new values based on human rights, secularization, Napoleon, liberty, fraternity, egalitarianism, and a challenge to the monarchies especially. So first, the monarchies were a challenge to the church, and then of course the people are a challenge to the monarchy. So it's definitely a game of politics to a degree, but religion plays a role both in terms of your individual spiritualism, but of course the institutional religion is a different matter. So with things like the French Revolution, you see Notre Dame very far back, shrunken down to almost insignificance, because I think that's the nature of kind of how they saw the church as a kind of corrupt institution. But I don't think this is really commenting on the Protestant sort of this revival of religion in the United States with Protestantism. This is really the French criticizing the church as an institution that stood in the way of freedom. And I think this, of course, is partly kind of the nature of the United States Revolution, a new wave of momentum led by the people. And of course, this recalibrates the nation from that, something that serves the rich, the elite, the aristocracy, the church, to one that serves the people. And I think that's really what you're seeing here. She's meant to represent the sort of nourishing, maternal nation, not the sort of heavy-handed kind of father disciplinarian or king or queen, but rather a nourishing nation that, nourishes the weakest, not just sort of streamline things for the richest and the most powerful. So it's like survival of the fittest versus, the protecting the weakest, right? And so she's urging people to, stand up and take arms, but she's not meant to be a real person. She's sort of like the Statue of Liberty, right? Kind of like Lady Liberty leading the people underneath the flag, which now represents the people and not the elite. There's sort of, or the king or the queen, right? So this is a big change and very kind of mirrors what's going on in the United States. But I think you have to think about, well, so at the end of all this, where does the church, what role does the church play? Do you just replace it with a kind of obedience to the state, or with a sense of morality that flows from a sort of reimagined nation that's all about the people? And of course, separating church and state might mean, well, what about the value system? Do we give that to the public education, to the teachers, to the family? So just things to think about. And here are the big guys with the white wigs, age of white wigs, which I don't know why that came to an end, but it definitely did come to an end. It'd be fun to throw on a curly white wig, and only your wife can kind of see you at home with your bare naked head. No one else can see. But yeah, Voltaire, Newton, and Locke are the big ones. Newton, famous of course for the Fig Newtons. Newton, I think everyone loves calculus. Voltaire, a lot of people, he's satire, parody. I will fight to the death for what you say, even if I don't agree with it, right? That surprisingly is kind of starting to fall out of fashion. The idea that people should have different points of view, and that's good because you want to welcome different points of view. I think there's something about the internet that wants to normalize and make everything kind of conform. So it's very interesting to me to think about how the internet has played a new role in sort of how we understand different things that up until recently had been sort of rock bottom principles of this country, like freedom of expression. Of course, John Locke, we've talked about him a few times, the tabula rasa, the idea of public education and separating church and state, and also the right to bear arms, stand up against tyranny. So that's an interesting one that divides people today. But the origin of the right to have weapons is basically to stand up to governments that are tyrannical. So today we've reached a level where I think we've kind of lost touch with that original reason why you would have that, but it's still, I think, important to get back to the origin, which is, of course, what the founding fathers will enshrine into the Constitution. There he is. Voltaire is probably a real character. Just tell from the wig, right? And he looks like he's got his real hair. That looks like the real stuff. But yeah, he's a very interesting person, and definitely, this, I think, really so fundamental to the United States. We're not really looking at this for the painting, but lovely painting. Um, and there they are, the founding fathers. Jefferson. I don't know if they wore coats this bright, but definitely Monticello is really neat. I remember going there with my ex-girlfriend, and we had a great time looking around at his house because it's all kind of that steampunk era, early industrialization. He had this sort of like this device where he'd write and it would copy because it has all these mechanical gadgets. Yeah, really neat stuff. And it's beautiful neoclassical building. And one thing to think about is how the United States resembles very much ancient Greece and Rome. And that is, I think, a way of, remember, the early Christians didn't want anything that looked pagan, so they kind of, had to invent their own imagery that fit this sort of new reality. The United States kind of has to reject the old world. It goes to a deeper source, which is the classical world, because there's something about the classical world which feels very reminiscent to what we want in architecture, which is transparency, accessibility, balance, separation of powers. And so the architecture of the ancient world really fits in with a kind of a value system, which is democracy, and of course, democracy itself goes back to ancient Greece and Athens. Of course, there are big, important issues we have to deal with, which is like slavery is incompatible with the modern world based on individuality and things like that. So I think that's certainly part of technology changing, value systems changing. And look at these two different views of the kind of arrival of the Spanish on the left. There's the age of people wearing tights back then. I guess they're still wearing tights here, but a little less pronounced. But these are the Puritans arriving to the New World up north. So this is about like 100, 150 years later. So very different, right? How is one versus the other? How would you characterize this versus this? Different, the same?
Well, the imagery includes the natives where it really didn't.
What's that?
The imagery and the illusion of the pilgrims coming and being all friendly with the natives.
Yeah, it's probably a myth, right?
Yeah.
But I think we can both agree that both of these are total nonsense, right?
Right.
In a lot of ways, like they're both very theatrical. They're both sort of the myth of Columbus and then the myth of the New World, and yet we're still comparing apples and apples, right? So they're two rosy pictures, right? But I think we can of course agree that this didn't take place quite like this, and this didn't take place quite like this. But interesting how the two myths are definitely kind of offering a very different myth, right? On one hand, the Spanish are just like, we're here to take over, and here they're like, no, we're going to offer a more noble. We are both working together, trading and talking to the Native Americans. The reality is probably a lot different than that, but I think that's the founding idea. That sort of or at least one thing that I would say is very notably different, and I admit not mythologically different, but that the Spanish came to kind of either, well, in the case of Columbus, discover, but then get gold and to get resources, whereas the British arrived, at least the pilgrims, to find a new world, and they brought women with them, and they came just with families, and just to basically settle, and not necessarily just kind of extract resources and conquer. So that, of course, there's a lot of exceptions to that, but in broad strokes, I think that is a notable contrast between one and the other. The Spanish were stewing in this reconquest, bloodshed in Iberian Peninsula, whereas the British were stewing in this kind of religious strife between Catholicism and Protestantism. But I think with the British, there's an effort to find resolution for that conflict, whereas the Spanish was about continuing that conflict, and there was no real sort of impediment to them. So I think it's just sort of 150 so years apart, and it's sort of different founding myth than what you see in Latin America with the Puritans, the pilgrims arriving. And the art is, this is some Puritan art in the late 1700s. I think what's your feeling here? What do you think they're trying to say? Are they lavish and rich and self-important?
Yeah.
Yeah?
They're boring.
No? What's that?
They're boring.
Yeah, pretty boring. I left you guys to say that because I didn't want to be too mean.
Bored.
Yeah, yes. They look kind of like almost like they look bored on the right. Maybe there's no music. This is maybe the age when music replaces art as a kind of real source of spiritual connectedness. He looks like he's waiting to be on the Quaker Oats box there. But there is a piety to it, right? She's almost like the wholesomeness of almost Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus, and they're certainly not trying to show off their richness or attire. So the Puritan art, the artwork and the people are very much rejecting that kind of lavish approach to painting. And yet, this is kind of, pretty plain and normal everyday life. Yeah, thank God the baby's there. Otherwise, I mean, they'd all be just staring out the window bored.
I know, we thought it was
I
needlework.
thought she was
sewing, yes, I didn't see a baby.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So here we go. The death of General Wolfe. So is this a religious painting?
No.
No, it's a guy dying on the battlefield. I think this is fighting the French and Indian War. You have to fact check me on that. But this is basically a picture from the New World showing General Wolfe falling on the battlefield. So what are we looking at? What's the message of this picture? Is he a good guy, the guy who's dying?
Seems to be,
Why do you say that?
because there's a Native American there and everybody looks relatively
Even the
sad.
Native American guy's like,
Yeah,
oh.
they're all sad.
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned the guy on the left because I think there's a really fun connection here. You know, today it would be like, he's evil, he's good, or, you know, sort of there wouldn't be this sort of fascination one with the other. I mean, if you go on Facebook now, it's like Mount Rushmore should be blown up, it's evil, whatever, and we still haven't resolved that kind of relationship with Native American culture here in the United States. The way, of course, in Latin America, you have a blending of Native American culture with you know, Catholic culture, Spanish culture, and even with African to a degree. But in the United States, you know, we have reservations, a Seminole Indian casino up there, and so even this for me is a moment where you see this kind of chief, kind of fascinated, or kind of having a moment of acknowledgement where he sees another chief, if you will, you know, dying. And so I think that's a really interesting moment where it's not necessarily about kind of we hate each other, but rather the kind of transcendent connection based on, you know, dying or fighting. And of course, the idea, the message here is he's kind of like a Christ-like figure who's sacrificing for his nation now, right? Not necessarily for, you know, God, but now the nation is the new ideal that you should be willing to sacrifice for.
That was in the Battle of Quebec.
Okay, thank you, Quebec, yeah. And it looks like, yeah, I think this is what the British versus the French, and the Native Americans were probably allies with one or the other. You know, think of Last of the Mohicans kind of stuff. Daniel Day-Lewis running through the forest with long hair. And there is, I think, an interesting reference here, you know, Jesus being taken down from the cross. So I think they're using, even though it's not a religious painting, they're still drawing on that well of religious imagery from the past to kind of anchor the morality in the picture. And interestingly for me, it's just now we're not looking at a picture of Jesus, and yet in a way we're still looking at the same kind of value system where it's all about sacrifice, in this case sacrificing for your nation or for what you believe in, versus necessarily, you know, fighting, you know, for a tyrant. And I think Jesus' sacrifice is different, you know, very different kind of sacrifice, and yet, you know, I think there's interesting and important parallels between one and the other. Here's a picture from the United States. You know, these are pictures from the New World. And I think the idea of a nation as a boat is very interesting. You know, a collective of people who have different, you know, personalities and whatnot, but they're working together, and the boat, you know, moves forward. So there's a kind of progress. We'll see that especially with Washington crossing the Delaware. And there's an almost holy quality. It feels almost like a myth to me. It has 1 foot in reality. I think this is meant to be Boston Harbor or the equivalent. But there's a kind of mythological, almost like Icarus falling into the ocean, and, you know, people struggling to pull the person out of the water. You know, I think I can't quite put my fingers on it, but there's something about them kind of, the canvas is still a sacred place because it's all about, you know, fighting against danger, protecting someone who needs help. And so there feels like a kind of, the artists are still treating the canvas as a place that's all about morality and not, you know, decadence and showing off who's rich and beautiful, but really working together to fight. I don't think that shark was based on very much anatomical accuracy, but we can forgive them because, you know, who can make a shark pose for
Why
it?
is he naked?
What's that?
Why is he naked?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think one, it makes him stand out and more holy and more vulnerable. You know, nudity in art is usually innocence and vulnerability, and I think here in this, it's meant to be kind of gives them this holy light of makes you want to protect them. It only reinforces a sense that they're sort of alone and stranded. But I think it's an interesting question. I've never really taken the time to fully understand. Because some paintings I kind of like to leave them, like I don't want to Google them, you know, I like to kind of leave them. This is one of them. The other one was La Primavera. The more I know about it, the less I kind of just prefer. And in this case, it just feels kind of like they're sort of, the 1 foot's in reality and 1 foot's in this sort of religious, you know, painting, right? Any ideas for you guys what might be going on here? I mean, you could say this is, you know, here we are in 1778, 2 years after the Revolution. So it could be some reference to, you know, the American symbol of the United States is Columbia. And I don't know if it's meant to be Columbia, but certainly that could be one idea.
Oh, here's who it is.
Okay.
This depicts the future Lord Mayor of London,
Oh, okay.
Brooke Watson, who as a teenager lost his leg to a shark. That does not look like a teenager.
So maybe this is supposed to be
while
London and not the
swimming
United States.
in Havana Harbor.
Oh, interesting. Okay, could this be? I don't. So where does it say this is located then? London, you think?
He was attacked in Havana.
Havana, it's taking place in Havana.
Havana.
But Havana, Cuba? Oh,
Yeah.
Savannah, Georgia.
Havana,
Havana.
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 Huh, that's hard to believe because of the towers.
And
are
a
interesting.
black sailor forms the apex of the composition, holding a rope for the victim, who later famously defended the slave trade in
Okay.
the West Indies.
Oh,
Well, that's good because
yeah.
that's kind of where I was going with this. So I was kind of intuitively on the right track with the slave trade. Because certainly he's an important figure to see on the boat included. It's almost like an acknowledgement that you've got this kind of multifaceted fabric. And this, I think, is very much a precursor to the Washington crossing the Delaware. Maybe not intentionally, but we'll see that in a moment. So thank you for looking that up. I certainly need to know more about that painting, as obviously, before I talk about it. So here we got, who is this here?
George Washington.
Yes, very good. And what do you say? What would you say about George Washington? What's he like?
So regal and
Humble,
Humble. Why humble?
because he refused to stay president and walked away from power.
Right. Yeah, that's so important. You know, very rarely do you see a leader either step away from power or forgive your enemies. You know, Nelson Mandela is a great example of someone kind of forgiving the previous generation. I think George Washington is a really noble figure who understood. I think it was based on the guy named Cincinnatus, a Roman kind of precursor or model for the idea of relinquishing power because it's a nation of laws and not a nation of men. So going back to what you said about nation of laws, I think that is really what he understood. That you really need to keep passing power to the next person, or you go back to bloodshed, right? So I think the picture of Washington is really a great contrast to this guy on the right, same head, same hair, but different body, right? Almost the same head, right? The wig really is.
Is that George?
Yeah, that's King George, not George, that George, two different Georges.
George the First.
This is George, the one and I think he was very sick, if I remember correctly.
Oh,
the
wait,
movie,
this is
The
George
Madness
the
of King
George
George.
the Third, the mad one, yeah.
Yeah, so,
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
inbreeding, a lot of access to alcohol and other things that a normal person, and of course, lavish clothing, not one sign of religion there on the right. And you could say even on the left, there isn't necessarily anything conspicuously religious, but I would say the rainbow, you could argue, is a religious symbol. But I don't think you need, and I think it's a great example where you don't need the religious symbols to still feel like this has a, one foot very strongly in Protestant values of piety, not showing off sort of your riches, but instead welcoming you to have a seat, please, come on in, welcome to my home. Whereas I don't think I'd, feel very welcome in his home. I don't think the idea here, you'll trip all over his cape and his, yeah, and of course the whole idea was extract resources from the New World, and then we become they manufacture them in England, and we become a sort of a captive market to buy all their stuff, which is brilliant capitalism, but also maybe not a good recipe for having good relations with the colonies. And of course, when Napoleon comes along, the Spanish colonies will completely break from the Spanish Empire because they don't want to swear allegiance to a French king. But that's in a few decades from here, maybe a century from here. What are we looking at this? Here.
Versailles.
Yeah, this is the Palace of Versailles. Looks a little bit like a model to me. I don't know if that's a real photo, but it gives you a sense of what it looks almost like the University of Tampa, the Plant Hall. It's so long. I think Plant Hall is cooler, at least on the outside. But I think what I love about this is it really, he designed, not he, but the Louis XVI, I think, was the one who commissioned it. He made it as a place to keep the nobles all under check, so he could basically keep them in his control, which is brilliant, right? And so you have to think about this place as not necessarily a palace, but like a trap, right? A bear trap or some kind of, like a tool. And it really, when you think about it that way, it is kind of like, wow, okay, it's like, it's beautiful and big, but it does almost feel like a big kind of like trap that you get the native nobles in there, and then you have all the sort of, you keep them isolated from their places and keep them in check. And it's a beautiful, it's certainly lavish and beautiful, almost kind of like, St. Peter's as lavish on the inside, maybe not as lavish, but in fact the churches do kind of resemble the lavishness of palaces in this era, and this is exactly why I think there's a sort of momentum away from, kings and queens and even the Catholic Church, because it's just gone too far, the same way the palaces of sort of this exorbitant cost that leaves everyone else without bread and I think this is a low point in the history of art. Completely. And I say this every time, because this for me covers basically 1600s, 1700s. This is kind of art, the ultimate in secularization of art, where we go from art that's spiritual and sacred to art that's really like the equivalent of like what, a telenovela or a
Early
soap
porn.
opera. So it's like a love triangle between the sugar daddy who probably owns this estate, is pushing the woman, young lover, who's kicking off her shoe as the lover is peeking up her dress. And so, I think that's the idea. It's really just the equivalent of a love triangle. And I think it really shows how, yes, you can paint anything you want on a canvas. And once you remove religion, this is the kind of thing that's a very low-hanging fruit. I think it's meant to be silly, and I'm not condemning it. It's wonderful painting, but for me, this for me symbolizes the very nature of the sort of out-of-touch elite. This would be like, I don't know, Epstein's Island or something. Just sort of like the equivalent of people, just rich people who are sort of indulging in their vanity on this sort of isolated place away from the kinds of situations that lead to the French Revolution. And so the United States Capitol building, I think, is a really interesting contrast. Not just maybe, I think it actually has more of a kind of continuity from St. Peter's, and especially if you think about, it's almost church-like. It aims upward towards God, in God we trust. And I think the building aspires, literally aspire, aiming upward to God, connecting heaven to earth, just like the Statue of Liberty is a conduit between heaven and earth. And inside the Capitol building, although I don't think I've ever been there, except maybe as a kid, so I gotta add that to my list, is a real facsimile or real similar blueprint to what we saw as the basis of the Christian church, that sense of order and harmony and balance and accessibility and, of course, connection to God. And so, the Capitol building, there's a staircase that says, come right on in, lawn that leads right up to the building, and the building itself aims upward, and you've got those sort of columns that make it feel like there's a sort of free entrance between the indoors and the outdoors, whereas Versailles feels a lot more like kind of it's meant to spread out like a wall and really kind of reinforce maybe the power of the king. So I love that architecture is more than just sort of a building, it's also a value system, right? Some people compare like a church to like God's microscope, looking into the microscope at us. And so there's an interesting idea there, but also, connecting heaven to earth. But it's a secular building. And yet, even though it's a secular building, it still has an underlying feeling of religion or purity, the color itself. And inside is the first National Art Gallery. So these are, and has anyone been there? I'm sure some of you have. Yeah. So you see a lot of famous people in that room. Do you remember any of the ones you saw there?
John Gorey.
Okay, John Gorey, the guy at Gorey. No, he's in there?
That's in Florida.
Okay, I went to Gorey.
Every state has two.
Okay, every state has one person?
Two.
Has two people. And so we got
And
John
John
Gorey.
Gorey
So
is
is he
one of
from
our
Florida?
Our
Yes,
others is
that did Gorey Elementary.
Yeah, I went to Gorey. Yeah, absolutely.
You're
invented air
elementary school.
conditioning.
Yeah, that's what I hear. Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I had no idea that he was in the Capitol
The other
Rotunda.
one is,
Very cool.
is it Billy
And
Bowie?
so Gorey and who else?
It's some Indian.
Who's the other Floridian?
It's an Indian.
I don't know.
Like a Native American guy?
It's Billy Bowlegs or somebody like that.
Okay, interesting. So okay. So there's at least 100 sculptures in there then?
It starts with a T.
Okay.
Anyway, go ahead.
Tecumseh?
No, I've been in
Google it.
Yeah.
It's
And so you remember the Pantheon? That's like a collection of gods in the Pantheon in Rome. I think it's Rome. Yeah, Rome.
Yeah.
So this is like a pantheon, collection of secular gods, right? These are figures who aren't saints, but might as well be saints, right? People who we elevate because they contribute really important things like cool air inside of a building, which of course in Florida is so important. Definitely you're worthy of sainthood if you invent air conditioning, no question about it. The patron saint of Wi-Fi, the patron saint of air conditioning.
But it used to be, so they changed.
I don't know who any of these. I can't spot. This guy looks kind of like someone maybe William Henry Clay or
The
something.
two Floridian statues, I guess, are John Gorey, father of air conditioning, and Mary McLeod Bethune, the influential educator and civil rights activist.
Okay, all right, interesting.
And she replaced whoever that Indian was.
Yeah, so Mary was installed in 2022, replacing a previous statue of a Confederate general.
Ooh, that was probably a good move.
Good job, Florida.
Yes, well done.
That's a fascinating subject too. I think you have to remember the past, right? And so when I teach my class at Ringling, I have my students all do an assignment where they have to come up with a nation of their own imagination, right? And always, and the whole point of the assignment is you can't really come up with a nation that doesn't have some conflict, some problem, because otherwise there's really nothing to overcome to kind of become a nation. So every nation has sort of its own history that's bloody or forgettable or regrettable. And, of course, in the United States, it's slavery. And, it's an interesting subject, iconoclasm, tearing down a sculpture, because, I can understand it's sort of a sculpture of Hitler, like, of course not, right? And yet there's a spectrum from, like, Hitler to Confederate soldier to, Buddhist statue in Afghanistan to, destroying a sculptures like we just saw earlier, And so, there's no absolutes, and yet I always find the sort of absence of a sculpture worse than kind of the sculpture itself, because it means we don't replace it with something. And so it's been very interesting for me to look at kind of how we, reflect on the history of slavery, because, I think we want to remove the sculpture because it's a reminder of something that we want to forget. And yet you don't necessarily want to forget, of course, but you also don't want to necessarily celebrate things that we might want to, we don't want to celebrate anymore. So, it's very interesting for me. I think if someone collected all those sculptures people tore down and put them in one place, it would be a very popular place, because we also want to see things that are taboo. So, kind
Make a
of
museum out of it.
there's the rotunda, and then there's like the basement rotunda with all the other sculptures that are from the past that we want to forget. Yeah, very interesting. So here's George, the big GW, now posing as kind of like Zeus. And this is from 1840.
Wow.
Yeah, has anyone seen this one before?
No.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun, right? So what's the message of this picture? So as I said, we go back to ancient, not only does the architecture go back to ancient Rome, here George Washington's, donning a toga woven by hand by Martha Washington, of course. George, where's your I'm holding my sword. Where are you, George? I'm in my chair holding my sword. So what's he doing here? What's the pose all about? This young, fit,
Yeah, buff.
George Washington. This is AI George Washington in sculpture form. So what's the message here?
Well, I guess he's supposed to be a Roman representing democratic ideals.
Right, and so how does he represent those ideals in physical form here?
Toga.
Okay, so when you say toga, like literally a connection. What's that?
Roman.
Well, Roman, Greek.
Okay, so the physical, the clothing is reminiscent of that era when democracy was more important, of course, or was born, you could say, at least with Greek. The Romans have, republic, which is also important. So what else apart from that?
Give it to somebody.
Giving the sword.
In the back?
Pointing to heaven.
Good, very good. That's always a giveaway. In the history of art, there's a few important themes we'll see, and pointing to heaven is a big one. We'll see that again today. And pointing to heaven is...
One shoe on and one shoe off. I can't
No,
tell.
no
Oh.
shoes.
No shoes.
Well, he might have some kind of
Sandals.
sandal
Looks
thing
like
going
he has
on.
a sandal on that
Yeah, I
one
think he
foot.
has sandals.
He doesn't look like he has.
His front foot looks swollen.
Yeah, maybe swollen front foot could be. I don't know. It could be just distortion from the photograph, or just anatomical oversight. But I think the pointing to heaven is really important, because in God we trust, and pointing to heaven means it's not him, it's not George Washington the man that we looked up to. Even he is subordinate to heaven, right? So, and not only that, I think you could say one, he's looking up to heaven, but you could also say that pointing finger is like the lighthouse idea, or the spiritual conduit of the Statue of Liberty. She's channeling heaven down her arm, through her body, or through his body in this case, and down to the sword, right? And what does the sword represent?
But he's giving the sword.
To who?
Passing the sword to someone.
Right, to the next person. I think in this case, John Adams, right? John Q. Which one was it? John Q. Adams?
Samurai president.
Was that his vice president? Was that his VP? I can't remember from my AP
Yes.
European. But yeah, the idea here is basically a peaceful transition of power. He's happily handing a sword to the next person, not pointing it, but passing it to the next person.
It's
And
a
that's
sheathed sword too.
what's that?
It's a sheathed sword.
Yeah, and it's a sheathed sword. So it's not ready for violence, but rather it's the sword that symbolizes power and peace, peace through enforcement. You see that with Lady Justice. She's got a sword, also I think sheathed. So yeah, important observation. So one, he's pointing to heaven, kind of deferring to heaven as a sort of basis of authority, but also he's kind of channeling that authority to the sword, which ultimately gives to the next person, because that is exactly what he's meant to represent, kind of someone who's happily willing to pass on power to the next person for the sake of everyone else. And as a result, he gets to look like this. Good for you. And of course, a great
He
contrast.
had his
We
hand
have a
up.
question.
This guy, who is he?
Wait,
Question.
Alex.
Question.
I was just
Oh,
saying.
you had a hand up, so sorry.
Just as reminiscent, I don't know exactly what was going on or who was the president then.
Let me see, wait, hold on, hold on.
But it just-
1840, wait, let me see. Oh gosh, that's gonna be hard. That's after Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, it's.
Maybe Monroe. No, that's after Monroe. Oh, we got an
It just-
alarm. Uh-oh. I've upset
False
someone.
alarm, it's okay.
Okay, good.
It just seems like
getting ready to get
the way
out.
we often look back
You're having a
on past
flashback.
times
He doesn't take your
as
trauma.
simpler than they
Leave.
were.
Yeah.
You know, it's Roman times,
got
they
actually
got
had
together.
Together.
George Washington, when he was president, we really had it together. You don't really remember the trials and tribulations that they had to go through. But in 1840, they were probably dealing with slavery issues and
Yeah,
other things.
Right,
The world seemed
states'
very
rights.
confusing
No, that's
to
an
them.
important to put this sculpture in the context, absolutely, of 1840s to kind of offer a new vision of Washington to remind people of kind of
Yeah,
and so yeah, I
those
agree
were
with
the
you.
good old days.
Yeah, I think this is a really really have to think of 1840 as a time when people were sort of maybe starting to transition into that from the Jeffersonian to the sort of Andrew Jackson or whatever
Yes.
comes thereafter. And of course, technology, steam engines, mid 1800s. So big changes going on. But of course, at this point, the United States is still kind of hesitantly expanding because of issues of slaves, states' rights, slave states versus non-slave states. And even Tampa in Florida really roars to life in the late 1800s because industrialization kind of waits until the Civil War. So yeah, I think this is almost like a way of saying like, come on everybody, let's hold it together, be peaceful, almost
Steve, like,
foreshadowing
remember
the
who we
Civil
are?
War.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah.
Like to sort of say, remember who we are.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you
Before we
always
plunge
remember
into
values. Through rose-colored
strife.
glasses, you say, oh, the past was much simpler, much more easy, and we're living through a crazy world now, but back in George Washington's time.
Well, I don't know that I think they're saying, oh, wasn't it great then? I think maybe they're saying, let's try to remember the basic values that we formed for. Rather than let it all fall apart in chaos.
Possibly true, but, we look at this time as extra crazy, and we forget about maybe Vietnam, how that was crazy at that time, and we might say, oh, the good old days back in the
Or the good
late
old days,
60s.
the good old days of the Civil War.
Yeah, and they never were good old days.
Just so you know, for me, the good old days was from roughly 1980 until 1998. That between the internet and kind of whatever, but certainly for me, like when I grew up, it was like the Cosby Show, Michael Jackson, like it was a sort of almost like a post-racial America, and it kind of gone back the other way. So I certainly do, of course, the Cosby Show.
And then we
Oh,
have
yeah.
the Cosby Show and Cosby, and we have Michael Jackson and pedophilia,
Right.
and so our illusions.
Right.
What's
Right.
perfect
Right.
and
And one
wonderful.
day this will be the good old days
Yeah.
too, of course. So, but yeah, I think that's such an important point that you make, that this sculpture is very much a kind of like holding the Titanic together before it falls into two with the Civil War. And of course, we have to talk about the Civil War. We'll get there in just a moment. And who are we looking at here?
Napoleon.
Right, Napoleon. Of course, he, even Beethoven was like, yes, Napoleon's going to liberate us all from, oh my God, he invaded Vienna, and then he tore up his concerto, he renamed it, and now it's called the Eroica. So, he was really kind of like the savior of Europe, saving everyone from the monarchies. Only, well, here you go. Does he look like a guy who's, hates the monarchs? No, he looks like he wants to be, a monarch with two scepters, not one. And you gotta love that he's got the fingers pointing to heaven, but it's a big golden rod that's pointing to heaven. So yeah, this is exactly, why you don't want a nation of men. You want a nation of laws, because this is very much what Washington could have been, but isn't. So I think this is such an important contrast. And we're going to see this throughout the history of, I think, the 20th century and, the 19th too, the contrast between the sort of totalitarian dictator versus this sort of, yes, democracy. If you want to solve problems really quickly, it's not the thing to do. But if you want to have everyone involved and slowly solve problems in a kind of like a tree growing a deep root rather than a shallow root, that's kind of what you want to do. If you want to solve your problems overnight, yeah, but then you might have bloodshed and conflict. And of course, that happens with Napoleon. He leaves a power vacuum, and all the monarchies come back, and European sort of democracy waits another 50 or so years. And of course, Napoleon is another great contrast to Washington. I think an important contrast too, because this is the sort of, welcoming, grounded, pious guy, and this is the sort of like fighting, militarized Napoleon, and all. This is certainly a romantic moment here, but of course, what's waiting at the end of all this is what we just saw a moment ago, sort of him betraying the values that he stood for, becoming the very thing that he claimed to fight against. Now, this is very interesting for me because I didn't know until becoming an art historian that, I remember seeing this in the Don't Eat the Pictures. You guys know what that is? The Muppets movie? That they get locked in the museum overnight. That's a great movie. Yeah, probably the basis for Night in the Museum. Anyway, so this is actually in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. At least it was last time I was there, and it's actually by a German painter. So I didn't know that, but I think that's so interesting for me when I think about that because basically German is like, this is how I see America, like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone and all these people on a boat fighting icebergs and crossing the river, and it's a very romantic view of the United States. But the whole point was to basically tell Germans we should be like them. We should unify into one country. As many of you may know, Germany was one of the last countries to unify into the modern nation that it is, and that's because all of Europe probably was like, we don't ever want Germany to unify because if they do, it's going to be a lot of problems. And of course, we know Germany, right? World War I, World War II, and maybe even you could say the European Union is now kind of dominated by Germany, and whether that will last, we'll see. But I think what's so interesting for me is, you've got almost like a weird foreshadowing of a bunch of boats crossing the ocean to go save Europe from Germany, which is of course Normandy. So this feels oddly kind of, I don't know, ironic or something. This idea that a German painting this only to rally Germans to unify, and then of course for Germany to start World War I, and then the United States goes and saves Europe from its totalitarianism. And you could say that's still kind of the case today with Putin versus the West. So, I think the model of the blueprint of Napoleon is very important contrast to the Washingtonian model. And, I think you have to remember that the French Revolution was not a spiritual revolution. It's more kind of about fighting power and, needing sort of a new state that represents the people. And you could say the same, of course, about the United States, but, there's a kind of Puritan blueprint that's very different than what you see with Napoleon, of course. And here, I think that contrast continues into the 20th century with Hitler. What's he doing here?
Posing.
Like posing in front of his trophy, right?
Yeah.
What a trophy, right? The Eiffel Tower.
You know, one thing, Alex, that I think is really interesting, if you go back to the King George and George Washington, the split screen, and they're both making use of a classical motif.
Right,
There
the
we have it.
column, yeah.
So you see the columns
there.
and
and
column
that,
and the drapery.
And you see that throughout all of this, that you have the young country, George Washington, appealing to the Roman Republic, going back to the classical ideals. But you see the emperors on the other side doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, even his pose is more
Yeah,
classical. He's got the
appealing,
contrapposto,
yeah,
that's twisting.
One democratic,
Yeah,
one imperial.
Yeah, and it's kind of like they're
Yeah.
both kind of claiming authority from the same, drawing it from the same well,
Same rug.
right?
And they just appeal back to the classical past
Yeah.
That's right.
in
It's
Rome
just a
and
complete
Greece.
mirror.
But they're doing it in different ways or for different reasons.
And it's funny because even
Yeah.
Washington has more, like he has a lavish carpet, but it's the furnishings, not so much the outfit. So there is some lavish elements to him, but I think it's meant to be symbolic, like a throne, or even at this point we're celebrating him. But of course we see this, we look at the painting on the left, we're like, we know the painter who painted this is sort of offering a very wholesome view of Washington, whereas you think the person who painted this knows that if they painted bad, the king's going to cut off your head, right? So even that, you're like, you understand that the artist is a different sort of point of departure. But yeah, I think that's so interesting that they both are kind of claiming authority from sort of
a classical past.
yeah, the classical world.
Yeah.
And they both buy drapery from the same source and that kind of thing. Same, you need a painting, rent out drapery for you. But yeah, even, these two, for me, is the same contrast as the one we just saw. In this case, he's kind of leaning, you could say literally, on the French, landscape. In this case, he's autographing, this is who?
Eisenhower.
Right, Eisenhower, a military leader who becomes, a president, pretty good president too, highway system, right, desegregating schools, and here he's signing autographs with the other enlisted people, and, he's brushing shoulders with the average, Joe, and I love the outfit too, because Hitler, looks like he went to, some special leather shop where it looks like he's a mechanic, like a very practical, almost working class kind of approach to, clothing.
When you look at the body language between the two, and Eisenhower just shows so much more strength and power in just standing, not even looking at
Right.
camera or anything. There's more,
More at home in his own skin.
Right.
and
Yeah, and I
Hitler
think
looks like he's trying to hide in the middle of a photo.
right. Yeah, he almost seems kind of insecure and like really self-conscious. Yeah. So really fascinating. Even and Eisenhower definitely has that sort of Washingtonian quality of humility. If you watch his speeches and that famous what was it, military-industrial complex speech, was very fascinating. And yeah, definitely an interesting president who was like Washington, a military leader who became president. And so going back to Napoleon now, this is a very famous picture of Napoleon's troops on the right invading Spain, and that is really important when I teach Latin America to my students. This is the beginning of the dominoes falling in Latin America, where most of the colonies declare independence except Cuba, which the Spanish Navy could easily blockade and kind of keep under their thumb for much longer. But in this case, this is Spain being conquered by tyrannical. So Napoleon was supposed to be a liberator, but here he's acting like a tyrant. And you see any religious elements to this painting?
With the arms out.
Right, the arms out is sort of like, crucifixion, and also sort of, he has a stigmata, as you can't really see here, but he actually has stigmata. So if there's any doubt, he's literally putting stigmata, maybe violence. And what are they doing? Who are these people, do you think? On the left.
His supporters.
The people standing up to Napoleon. So these are the Spaniards, the average Spaniard, I think he's meant to represent the average Spaniard, standing up to tyranny. So now, instead of, Jesus maybe standing up to, evil or sinners or whatever may be the case, now you've got a sort of someone sacrificing on behalf of their nation, right? So that, again, sort of the nation becomes a sort of new, sort of, not a religion, but a sort of new kind of symbol of that which should nourish the average person, and not just a symbol of power and tyranny, but kind of reinventing the nation as something that's supposed to nourish the average person, and it's worthy to sacrifice yourself for your nation if it is in fact something that is meant to represent you. Of course, Napoleon, you gotta love the expression here, Napoleon's defeated, the monarchies come back, but in the United States, we see a lot of promise still with progress moving forward. In Europe, there's sort of a little bit of a hiccup there, and then eventually they get their act together. Well, we'll see. But here we've got Lady Liberty leading the people, the equivalent of Liberty leading the people. And who do we have here? Well, this is Columbia. This is our Statue of Liberty floating across the Midwest. And this is very much a kind of symbol of what we've reduced the United States to like the East Coast, and there's the West Coast. And you see what she's doing? You actually see kind of, this is kind of like Superman.
What is that in her arm?
What's that?
What is that in her arm?
Yeah, she's stringing the telegraph across the nation. So she's got a book. I'm sure it's probably the same book as the Statue of Liberty. I'm guessing. I don't know for sure, but maybe is it the Bible? Is it a sort of just symbol of authority? I don't think the Statue of Liberty is holding the Bible, but you could still kind of see it as like the idea is like the Bible is a word of God, right? Or at least that's the idea that we get that from God. Well, the book that we have, whether it represents the Constitution or any book, kind of should have its basis some kind of authority, whether spiritual or otherwise. Of course, Statue of Liberty is channeling heaven down to earth. I think just the idea of a book is like, these are the sacred values we hold dear to us, right? Now, she's stringing the telegraph across the country. Not only that, she's also leading, kind of escorting like a bellwether, leading the trains across the country. So here on the left, you see the buffalo running away. There's the Native Americans. Kevin Costner somewhere hidden away in there. By the way, I did rewatch Dances with Wolves recently, so you don't have to. And I will say there's a few moments that are, yes, it's very kind of white man focused, Kevin Costner, yada, yada, yada. But there are some nice moments, actually. It's not the worst movie about Native Americans about that era. So it's worth a rewatch. You can decide otherwise. But this is a very interesting painting, of course, because it's technology and progress, but with this sort of all the airs of holiness and spiritual and manifest destiny is very loaded with religious symbolism, right? The idea that you're a nation, like the Jewish people, the chosen people, like a destiny. You have a spiritual, a holy destiny. Of course, that can be good or bad depending on the sort of the details, right? But nevertheless, I think it's a very fascinating picture showing progress in terms of this sort of Lady Liberty leading technology. And I think when you look at technology, you can't really just dismiss technology, because who would deny their children clean water and glasses and electricity? So I think you really can't just see this as a picture of just like the white man conquering, whatever, the Native Americans. It's really about progress and technology, kind of this inevitable wave that's, comes across the country and spreads west. Of course, that's really unleashed after the Civil War. that's really when railroads spring to life, and you get people like Flagler and Plant coming down to Florida in the 1800s, late 1886 around there. I think the Plant Hall was built in 1890. So Florida has its own, off to the right this way. Comment, question?
There was 95.
Got a little bit more to go. We got a little bit more time to cover. So here we look at the Mexican-American War. And so this is right around the time when you were at Jefferson, the Washington sculpture you were talking about. And so you might think about how that relates to Mexico and the United States having this showdown. And what do you see here? What do you think is a real big part of this picture here?
They're getting
The newspaper.
news of what's
Right, the
happening.
news, right? We talked about expression and literacy. You really can't separate the modern, once you have literacy, you kind of have the ability to legally sign your name, which means you have sort of legal existence, right? And so literacy goes hand in hand with individual rights and sort of valuing the individual as sort of, sacrosanct. And on top of that, you also have a bunch of people gathered around to hear the news. That looks like, like a bunch of different immigrants, maybe Irish or different groups that come together and assimilate, African American down there on the lower right with a lot of sort of color symbolism for the United States. But the idea is here, the news brings everyone together, reading the news, hearing the news, almost like a George Washington figure there on the right, someone's telling him what he's saying, and everyone's standing on the post office, front porch, and a very kind of wholesome view of the United States is kind of a collection of people from different parts of the world hearing about the news in Mexico. And now a lot of the soldiers in the Mexican-American War fought with each other and then would go on to fight against each other in the Civil War. So that's a fascinating thing for me to think about, that the Mexican-American War was sort of a rehearsal for the Civil War. And, very similar ideas, like expanding into new territories. And of course, the landscape becomes a new kind of subject in this era. I don't want to go too deep into this, but there was a year without a summer because of a volcano that erupted around the world, and a lot of sunsets were these beautiful colors because all the particulate in the atmosphere. So people started painting landscapes. This is right around the time of Mary Shelley. She actually wrote Frankenstein because she was stuck inside all summer and needed to write something because else she'd go crazy. So she wrote Frankenstein because there was this year without a summer. And that's when a lot of people started migrating west in the United States. I think this is year 1816. And so as a result, the landscape becomes a new subject in painting. And I think it's an interesting moment again to think like, well, is this a religious painting? Is this God's earth? Is this Eden? What do you fill in the void of religious subject matter? I don't even think you see people, maybe small little figure there, but it's almost like a nation is now, a landscape is a symbol of your nation. It reinforces the idea that this is your homeland, you should be proud of your home, and it's very interesting, if you think about how that relates to our new vision of what a government should be based on the people, well, the landscape becomes a kind of, this is the stage on which we all act, and it's very much corresponds to your nation and your sense of identity. Likewise here, this is probably like the Rocky Mountains, right? Definitely not Florida. We can agree on that. And of course, photography is really important because, photography is proof. Photography is, I'd say, the least spiritual of all the media we've seen, mosaic painting. And yet it is really important because it aligns with this idea of importance of the individual, right? So we now see individuals part of art history, where, before it was, religious figures or political leaders. And so this is really a big part of this whole world based on technology, affirming the value of the individual, and photography gives everyone a chance to sort of be part of art history. Now, who are we looking at here? Any guesses? I think it's probably the 54th. I don't know if there were other regiments, right? Well, even better Civil War movie, or even better movie, Glory. I absolutely love Glory, great movie. And, to look at the camera before you go to battle means you sort of have this last moment of reckoning. The camera's almost this godlike, immortal device that gives you a chance to sort of speak and be seen, which is really wonderful. But of course, we take photography to other extremes, and with selfies and all that. But I think this is a really powerful moment where you think about war and war in art, and of course Napoleon versus Lincoln. Photography helps you know who you're going to vote for, right? And know the person, the man, the person. The painting is not necessarily the most honest form of having to pick a candidate. I don't know if I pick a painting or I want to see a photograph of them versus a painting. And so you can see how the painting or the photograph becomes a sort of form of journalism, whereas painting was a kind of a spiritual or sort of a different sort of, just a whole different mindset, right?
Propaganda for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to say propaganda because it has a full range from this you could say is propaganda, I guess, but it's like a different kind of personalized way of offering kind of a moment. And I think this is a great painting addressing slavery because this is the kind of thing you couldn't do when you were a slave. You couldn't teach music to your child, right? You couldn't have your family together. Even the banjo is a very uniquely American instrument. This is a very famous artist who didn't do a lot most of his paintings are actually religious paintings. I don't have any here today, but I think that's why a lot of art historians don't like him because art historians sadly are very secular and kind of not religious based, but it's a very powerful painting about slavery, even though it's not directly about slavery. It's 1893, 30 years after Civil War, so probably he was a young man. Child probably doesn't even remember slavery, and yet it's still there, right? A better painting. This one, a really powerful painting. So this is the mistress visiting her former slaves. Talk about awkward, right? The most awkward moment ever. But the key thing about this picture is this lady here on the left, she would have been required to stand up during the time of slavery. But now she doesn't have to anymore because slavery is over. So she can sit down. And so the painting's really about the sort of subtle codes that existed and how things have changed. And I show these because they're not necessarily religious paintings, but there's a kind of unique American morality that we're using these canvases for, and they're really not paintings of rich people or political figures, whatever. They're paintings about these moments of kind of maybe ambiguity or morality and kind of everyday life. And I think it's a good thing to think about. Is this the people trying to, do you need to lean on religious subject matter, or is it? I still personally would say there's something religious about the morality of this picture, even just showing two groups coming together to find some kind of resolution. In spite of the sort of clear, contrast between the two, there's something noble about that. So I think they're all kind of striving for something that's kind of fitting for this new world. But of course, even this new world will be subject to all these technological changes. So is the Statue of Liberty a religious symbol? Not really, but of course, you could say she's got a lot of trappings of religion, right? We're kind of looking at Athena plus Jesus plus Alexander the Great because she's got the face of Alexander the Great, the radial solar kind of Sol Invictus, Apollo slash the halo.
Well, if you look at her up close, she kind of looks like Trump's love daughter.
Like who?
She does. She looks just like him up close.
Like Trump? Is that what you said? The face? No, interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, he does have the pouty lips. You're right. No, you're right. The pouty lips do kind of have that quality. And if you think about Wing Victory, the Nike, they saw the angels earlier, or even Caesar, the halo behind the Buddha. A lot of the Greeks influenced Buddhism in Central Asia. That's nothing for today. But that's why the Statue of Liberty has clothing, because the Roman. And of course, Lady Justice, she's got the sheathed, sword. So we're kind of looking at a kind of a concoction of all these different modern values. Justice is not we don't worship justice, but she's a personification of the ideals of justice: blind, non-prejudiced, deliberate, and of course has the authority of violence to, make sure justice is taken care of. Yeah, you're right. I see that. And I think it's also the classical face you see too. But you're right. The lips and the nose are very I definitely see that. But I also see the sort of classical face that we see in a lot of sculpture. But you're absolutely right. You're gonna upset a lot of people if you say that. So yeah, you got at least half the country, at least just under half the country. So here we've got going back to Europe for a moment in the late 1860s as they finally get their stuff together after the monarchies start to kind of fade into the past, which really finally happens with World War I. So here's a woman going to probably the city on a train. Everyone's sharing the train together. And it's kind of this holy light. It's very wholesome. So this for me is it's not a religious painting. There's something that feels like it's leaning on like a piety. It's almost like yearning for a piety. This for me is like celebrating a simple time as they realize things are about to kind of go to pot, right? Yeah, that is kind of what it feels like here. This sort of holy, noble moment with a woman going to market, maybe bringing her children with her, being on the subway in New York maybe would be the equivalent of that. Here, two guys breaking stones, I show this to my students at UT. Are you guys majoring in stone breaking? And of course, no one's breaking stones as a kind of career move. And, it's funny, but yeah, one day, like AI sees us all as this right now, right? So, why paint this? Well, because it's celebrating the honesty of hard work. They're not on their phones. They're not looking at the camera. They're focused on their work. And I told my students, at the moment the kid looks at his phone, you no longer respect them because now instead of working hard, now they're just in their little narcissistic vanity bubble. And, we all have to deal with that young generation one day flying our planes and, dealing with all the buttons on our gadgets with the doctor. So hopefully by then AI will replace them and we can rely on the technology and not the Gen Z. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, because
So,
that's gonna go well too.
Right, not going to go well. So this for me is like the absence of religion, right? Materialism. This girl who's gone to the city, probably got away from mom and dad, moved to Paris, surrounded by this luxury, champagne. It looks like it maybe is New Year. That's very weird because you can't tell if there's a mirror or if that's some guy in the back or whatever. It's that before or after. But for me, there's another one of those paintings where the less I know about it, the more I kind of like it because it just feels like she's really miserable in spite of what you might think is like, oh, she's got this great outfit, it's got a
She
cool.
looks like she's bartending.
Yeah, she's bartending, as you all know. Like it's one thing to be like, oh, being a bartender, and then like, oh, being a bartender,
And
whatever
it turns
job,
out
right?
There's another half to this painting they've recently found.
Okay, interesting.
They think that he cut it in half to sell 2 pieces.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
How enterprising.
Yeah. So for me, this really feels like a woman who's very miserable, looks very miserable. Am I right about that? I mean, I'm no good at interpreting female like body language, but you tell me.
Admitting it is half the battle, Alex.
This is a real stretch, but I always look at them like this is like the Venus, Venus when we saw her washing ashore in the clamshell. This is like the updated modern version of her where she's totally miserable and wants to go back into clamshell kind of thing. Like, take me back to the ocean because the oranges are one little overlap. Reaching this threshold here. Oh, man, I'm just totally reaching there. But anyway, so here's another great painting from this era of medical school, right? And here's the one woman, the 2 women in the picture. One's on the patient, and the other's a nurse. And these aren't religious paintings, but I think these are paintings about what paintings are in the absence of religion. And now we're kind of focusing on maybe subject, and yet they still feel very religious to me because it still feels like you've almost like got Christ taken down from the cross. You've got these moments of sort of reflecting on the nature of suffering. Of course, now it's filtered through this kind of medical, kind of engineering kind of language, and yet the real heart of the picture is like the one person who's kind of on the table is a female, and the woman who's there, she's almost like you can feel that she's restricted from full, access to being a doctor, and yet she can still be a patient. So why can't she be, a doctor too? So the heart of this picture is like this sort of, feeling excluded or feeling like that, you're not. Like the connection between the two, and I think that's just such a powerful kind of update on what you can do with painting. And I still think there's something about it that feels religious in the sense of like a holy light. And this guy's so boring sounding already. You can just tell how he's like. And here, Van Gogh, I think he really is finding that wholesomeness, the purity of this sort of poor family. That, if they were on their smartphones, that we wouldn't feel the piety and the wholesomeness of them having this moment, maybe on their way to work, before a hard day's labor. In the back, like a little mini Raphael painting there on the very far back, and like a clock. So there is a sense that there's religion as a part of their life, but I think the real holiness that he's identifying is that they have a connection, that in spite of being poor, you still have a lot going for you, which feels very Protestant, very kind of puritanical in the sense that you don't need lavish things, you just need relations. I think that's what the minister was talking about today, like not being isolated. So I think Van Gogh's really got his heart in the right place, and of course this is how we all feel today in the modern era to a degree, because we are, when you go to a city, isolated, right? Not here, but if you go to New York, you're dealing with bystander syndrome, right? Where people assume that someone else is going to help you if you're suffering. So this, I think, captures a feeling of modern life where you move, you have a lot of materialism, a lot of, even kids, I think Gen Z is feeling this right now, not all, I hope, but the feeling like, oh, I've got all this access, and yet, I still feel alone and kind of anxious, right? So very quickly, I just wanted to jump through some of the 20th century. I want to do a shout out to Metropolis, because Bruce and I were talking about Metropolis here, which is German. Film becomes a new kind of, once paintings dealing with photography and all that, now film comes along and offers a whole new sort of myth-making machine, and you see the robot become the new kind of part of the sort of human landscape. R2D2, C3PO, Luke's got a the bionic hand, and I don't know why people criticize this movie. Leia, it's all about Leia kicking ass, and for some reason, I don't know, I always thought it was like a perfect movie with like very cool male role models and female role models. But I think AI is sort of exactly kind of that sort of floating around in the background. Now AI can produce any kind of image you want, and there's something almost like demonic about that. I gotta say, like that, there's something about the imagination being able to summon images, but once a computer can just generate anything, there's something just really kind of creepy about that. Also awesome, but also you got to wonder where that leads to and reshaping us from within. And of course, satire and profanity becomes a sort of language of the modern era, which is, we're talking about where is sacredness. Well, you don't necessarily, you can tell jokes in church, but you get the idea that you're not supposed to, like, church is not a comedy hour, right? It's not like, meant to necessarily be entertainment. You're supposed to listen to Latin Mass and, holiness. And I think that's really important. When I went to the Radiant Church once and I couldn't handle it because there's too much music, too much festivity, too many people talking. I just wanted holiness and sacredness and calm and quiet. And it felt more like a rock concert, which is cool. Maybe that's what some people want. But I think we live in an age of profanity. Even the Mona Lisa has a mustache here because he's literally parodizing or satirizing the art world, especially after World War I. And of course, the mustache, just like pointing up to heaven, we've got the mustache as an interesting element in the history of art, especially with Charlie Chaplin and Adolf Hitler. So
Hitler copied Chaplin.
Yeah, which one copied whom?
Hitler copied Chaplin in that.
Okay. Say that again?
Hitler copied Chaplin in that.
Okay,
Chaplin
interesting.
had a mustache like that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Charlie Chaplin, definitely a brilliant guy, and a very important social commentary. And but he's not like a Christ-like figure necessarily, right?
Alex,
He's not.
can I
Yep.
interrupt 1 second? Because I've got to let my helpers leave.
Yeah, we're almost
now.
finished.
No, these are what's happening in September. If you would like to take one, and I would just like to say to Alex, this has been phenomenal.
Well, I hope to do it
Phenomenal.
again in the spring and the summer. So
Right.
I'll kind of invent a new subject, kind of with Christianity.
He's going to come
and-
back, but he's also going to do something in our Advent series
Great.
on the nativity and art. So that will be one of our 5 weeks that we do for that. So
Thank you guys.
anyway, thank you.
So
And
we're
I'm not trying
wrapping
to
it up.
rush you,
We're
I'm
almost
just going to
finished.
go let them go.
So when you think about the subconscious mind and the surrealism, I think you could say you could argue that there's a way you're looking for God in the subconscious, right? Even though it's Freudian analysis, you're looking in the mirror, you're still looking for a sense of like identity and meaning. But maybe in this case, absent religion, we struggle for meaning and identity through materialistic terms. We're looking in the mirror. We look for that sense of meaning and purpose in other places, and whether or not those are illusionistic are really, I think important for us to figure out. I look at this, Dorothea Lange, migrant woman with her kids. There's the same kind of that, and it's not like one is meant to be. That's not obviously she wasn't thinking, oh, the Virgin Mary, Jesus, and yet still guiding the picture is a sense of like connection to the emotionalism of the subject, worrying on behalf of her child, right? Her 2 children. You might not notice there's a little baby there too, in that picture there. So it's not, of course, the same picture, but there's a kind of underlying kind of similarity that I think is kind of the thesis I'm trying to make, that even though we're not we're not treating the canvas necessarily like religious anymore. Here's Grant Wood, 1930. I don't think this is more materialistic than this. This is almost that pious kind of wholesome Midwestern kind of, bootstrap, pull yourself up the bootstraps. And, Picasso's Guernica, there's nothing religious about it. There's no Christianity. And you can maybe argue, well, that's why this is happening, because there is no Christianity necessarily guiding this. Needing to kind of have some morality to check our ability to destroy each other with technology. And that's exactly what's going on with Diego Rivera's Man at the Crossroads, which is very much like a Jesus Christ figure, crucified by this sort of twin pillars of science, which is the microscope and the telescope, and everyone kind of looking on, the socialist side and the capitalist side. But you notice, socialism cuts off the head of the God, and so you do see a rejection of religion as part of socialism. So, yeah, and yet this guy feels really like scared about what's going on. He feels a lot of anxiety. We're almost finished, don't worry. And here's Frida Kahlo, a really powerful celebration of the individual self, of her own individuality, very much in the same time period as the Nazis are celebrating conformity and, doing everything and looking the same. And so really, I think for me, there's a really powerful contrast between, this is what we want, someone who's, honest and making, having some kind of direct, connection to the viewer as far as suffering, and you really can't disconnect that from religion. She's almost like Saint Sebastian, suffering, looking right at you, pleading. Whereas here, it feels like if you have any individuality or emotion, you're like, shut up, you gotta get back into line, get back into lockstep. And of course, we know where all that leads. So the art movements in the 20th century are really all about kind of, at least the early 20th century, you know, I think surrealism is the one that might get closest to religion. Of course, Dali is the one who swings back to religion and makes that central to his pictures. As you can see here, you know, really going back to kind of masterful, you know, huge paintings all about kind of the history of the world and religion. And we do see some exceptions here. I think Southern Man, Magritte is making some reference to here we are today. Updated Adam is now, you know, wearing a suit and tie and standing maybe at the last point, where the farthest point he can go. But I think it's really an interesting question to think about, like what role does religion play? And so I think in future classes I'll do, if it works out, is I'd like to focus on what I really, you know, my main focus was Mexico and Cuba, and to maybe either next summer or in the spring offer classes that are about how, you know, within Cuba in the 20th century and Mexico, what role does Christianity play, and kind of where it kind of rears its head, and maybe even think about the future of religion. But just one more shout out for my artwork. There you go. So if you want to see my artwork, I'll keep you posted. But that's it. So thank you so much. This has been really fun. And yeah, you'll see me again.